The French philosopher Jacques Derrida became quite interested in the topic of hospitality later in his career and in his life. And this little book that he wrote of hospitality is really quite interesting, and so I thought I'd do a couple of videos on it. In the first video here, we'll look at the first seminar in the book, and then in the second video, we'll talk about the last section, which kind of develops the points of the first seminar. So part 1 then is called Question d'étranger, venu de l'étranger, and you'll have to excuse my French. You're not going to hear too much of it, but we should start with the title here. So étranger in French can mean stranger or foreigner, but it can also mean abroad. And this is translated then as the foreigner question, or the question of the foreigner. And then the second part means coming from abroad, so venu is coming from abroad or from the foreigner. So a bit of an ambiguous title, but of course Derrida loves playing with language, and we're going to see lots of investigation of particular words and what they mean. I should also point out at this stage that in addition to these 2 seminars in the book, there is an essay by the French philosopher Anne Dufour-Montel. I don't know too much about her. It looks like she wrote a book about taking risks at one point, and then sadly passed away taking risks by trying to save people from drowning. So quite courageous in her own life. But the essay itself is not particularly interesting as far as I'm concerned. It touches on a whole bunch of things, but doesn't develop things too much. And as an explanation of Derrida, it doesn't really seem to add that much, but you can be your own judge. Okay, so we're going to talk about hospitality then, and maybe it's good just to add a little drawing here. So imagine that you have a house, right? There's your house. Okay, and when we think about hospitality, we think of, inviting people into our home. Let's add a little chimney here just for effect, really make it kind of cozy. And somebody's going to come and visit our home, and we want to show hospitality to this person. Let's give them a briefcase. There we go. They're coming from far away. Now, the very first thing that Derrida points out here, well, it's not literally the first thing, but he does point out that when we think of the home, we should think more broadly as well and think of the state or the country, because the foreigner or the stranger doesn't just come into my home, but is also coming to a country often. And we'll draw a quick abstract map of France here. So there we go. France. Usually France is said to be kind of roughly the shape of a hexagon, which is kind of interesting. So there is France. Okay, there you go. And you didn't quite get far enough, so we better keep drawing the arrows. So the stranger is coming to a country, he's coming to a home. Now, you should imagine yourself as the host here, perhaps. Well, you can think of yourself as the stranger too, if you like. But the host is in a unique position and needs to show hospitality to the stranger. So the host can be understood as the pater familias, in Latin, the father of the household, and as a result, the father of the household comes with a lot of power, right? And the word that Derrida likes to use is potestas, so Latin for power or authority. And another word that Derrida continually uses is the pronoun ipse in Latin, which means himself. And you can also translate this as the subject. So we have the subject-object distinctions, and the host is often in the subject position, and the foreigner or the stranger seems like an object of some kind. So how do we negotiate these kinds of relations? Now, one of the things that happens almost immediately when we have a stranger coming towards us is we kind of want to ask some questions. We want to know, for instance, well, what is your name, right? What is your name? What's your family background? Where are you from? What country did you originate from? And we're starting to ask questions. And for Derrida, as he said in his title, the stranger poses questions to us. These are what we might call necessary questions. How are we going to welcome the stranger into our home unless we ask these kinds of necessary questions. But Derrida also wants to put a question mark behind this because he kind of wants to say, well, are these questions necessary? So when we think of the stranger then, we can refer to the stranger as a kind of being in question, right? Being in question. We see this stranger coming towards us, and right away the stranger, his very identity is in question. Who is this person? How should we talk to this person? And so on and so forth. So the stranger then is not only somebody we need to question, or what we want to question, but the stranger for us raises the bigger question of questions itself. Do we have to ask questions? Do we have to ask questions to show hospitality? Can we not simply accept this person without question? By saying, you're welcome, just come on in. I'm not going to ask you anything. You are already being shown hospitality prior to being asked any questions. So at one point then Derrida writes, the question of hospitality is thus also the question of the question. And we can see now why that is, right? Because when we have the stranger coming to our house, not only are we asking questions, but we are asking, do we need to ask questions? What's the value of questioning? And this is a bigger question for Derrida because he often elsewhere raises this issue of, well, when you start thinking about philosophy, for instance, a lot of people, they start with one particular question. They start by asking, what is being? Right? Être in French. What is being? Is that the very first question of philosophy? And Derrida has some questions about that. He kind of wants to say, well, maybe not. Maybe before we ask what is being, we already have certain assumptions and certain instincts and certain ways of looking at the world, and we need to dig deeper and see, well, what is there before we ask this question of what is being? All right, then. So we have these different questions. Now, the thing that Derrida says is that as the stranger comes towards us, we tend to have a kind of instinctive response. And we feel that we have to respond to the stranger in a certain way. We have a kind of duty. So we're just going to call this absolute hospitality, absolute hospitality. And Derrida contrasts this with conditional hospitality, conditional hospitality. So what's the difference? Well, absolute hospitality is this kind of duty where you say, I have no idea who you are as a stranger. I don't necessarily need to ask questions, but I feel the need to treat you with dignity, with respect, to invite you in. And in this case, we may even not know very much about this person. So we're dealing with what Derrida calls the absolute unknown anonymous other, right? We may not even see a person, but we have this sense that towards another person, we have this absolute duty. On the other hand, we also have conditional hospitality, and this has much more to do with law. So if we think of conditional hospitality, when somebody comes to our country, let's say, that person has certain duties. They cannot just do whatever they want. They have to abide by the rules of the state. I also have duties and obligations towards the stranger, but I don't have to invite that person into my house. I just have to be respectful towards them and not show hostility. So that would be conditional hospitality. And most people, when they talk about hospitality, they focus on conditional hospitality. But Derrida wants to say something more dramatic. He wants to say that there's this larger ethical duty, absolute hospitality, that's always in the background. And whereas conditional hospitality has to do with law, absolute hospitality has to do with justice. Okay, so justice. Derrida has written a lot about this elsewhere. Justice is often part of the law if the law is good, but justice is this concept or this perspective that's always kind of vanishing. It's always difficult to grasp, kind of like a cloud that you can't quite get a hold of. So we search for justice, but how do we codify it? How do we actually turn it into law. It's a very difficult thing to do. Okay then, so what we've seen so far is that the stranger raises the issue of the question. There's a power relationship here between the paterfamilias, the host, and the stranger who comes in and is often on the margins and has to obey the laws of the country or the state. And we see this contrast then between absolute and conditional hospitality. Now, the other thing that Derrida does then, as he develops these ideas, is he talks about the sense of unease that we feel when a stranger comes. And Derrida talks about unease in relation to language and literature. So let's first start with language here. And when he talks about unease, he mentions that the word host, or in Latin it's hospes, okay, so hospes, is really a kind of split word. So if we look at the two roots of this, we see that in Latin we have hostis, okay, hostis, which means basically an enemy. Okay, and then the pes part goes back to potus, which means something like capable, having power, being able to do certain things. Now, hospes then is a word that means both host and guest or stranger. It means both of these things. And that's kind of bizarre, isn't it? How can we conflate host with stranger? How can we bring these two things together? And you can see in this word, hospes, which means both of these things, this weird dynamic, right? Where the host, the guest, there's this sort of sense of enemy behind it. There's something dangerous to inviting somebody into your home, but there's also the sense of power that we talked about before, which creates interesting power dynamics. And you can trace this word hospes back to Proto-Indo-European as well, and there we see some similar aspects too. Okay, so in language then, we see the sense of unease, the sense of overlap between the host and the guest. The categories tend to collapse, and how do we actually relate them to each other? Which one is which? We can also talk about literature here, and Derrida talks a lot about classical texts. So in this particular seminar, he deals with some texts by Plato. He talks about Oedipus a little bit. In the second seminar, he's going to talk more about Oedipus. But let's sketch out roughly what he says here. So first of all, he talks about Plato's work, the Sophist, or Sophist, depending on how you want to pronounce this. A sophist is a rhetorician. It's somebody who uses language particularly to impress and to manipulate and to really show their skill, but not necessarily to get to the deeper truths of life or to do meaningful work. So in the Sophist then, there's a character who's referred to as the stranger, or in the Greek, it is a xenos. Okay, and this is where our word xenophobia comes from as well. And the plural here is xenoi. So the xenos is the stranger who's a major character. And Derrida says, well, it's significant that the xenos is the one who does most of the talking in this dialogue, and the xenos has to define what a sophist actually is. So what we see is a number of different things then. First of all, we have this sort of suspicion of language when it comes to the stranger. So a suspicion of language. Whenever a stranger comes, that person often speaks a different language. They have a hard time with our language, and we become suspicious. So by having the stranger talk about sophistry, which is a use of language, right away it raises this question. Well, is the xenos also a sophist here? Another question that comes up is the question of parricide. So parricide is where you kill your father. And this particular stranger in this text is not literally killing his father, but what's happening here is that the stranger is being asked about the views of a different philosopher named Parmenides, and this is essentially the stranger's teacher. But the stranger disagrees with Parmenides on the question of what is being and what is not being. And that's the second part of the sophist dialogue. And so by disagreeing, he is in a sense criticizing the logos or the reason of Parmenides. And you can also relate this then to the host, right? Because the host is all about power. The host, in a sense, has the logos, has the reason, and the stranger is coming in and criticizing this. So it's very dangerous to do this, because if you metaphorically kill the father by destroying the father's arguments, then you're not going to be very welcome. It also raises the question of the family dynamic, because is the stranger inside the family or outside of the family? You can only kill a father if you are part of a family that has a father. And so, it raises this question, well, is the stranger in the family or outside of it? And we can think of the host as having a family as well. So the stranger enters into that family. Next, then, we see that the host is the logos. So we talked about this just now, and we'll just leave it at that. And then fourth, we see that in this dialogue we have a debate, right, between different characters, and the debate is described as a kind of combat with words. So that suggests that when a stranger comes into a particular place and uses language, language is not just innocent or a means of communication, but there's this tension that is part of it. And then finally, the stranger is associated with blindness and madness. So blindness and madness, but not necessarily in ways that you might think. The stranger is not necessarily mad. It is actually the logos that is often blind. And it's the stranger's job to criticize the culture's understanding of things, to criticize reason, what Derrida will call, in other words, works logocentrism. And so the stranger's job is to come in and to raise all of these kinds of questions about the logos. We need that outside perspective of the stranger. But the stranger also is easily seen as being mad, crazy. There's a distrust of the stranger that's very difficult to dispel. Now, this madness comes out in a different character as well. So we've talked about the sophist here a little bit, but we should also mention Oedipus, right? So Oedipus, who's really more the subject of the second seminar, but Oedipus, famously in the classical texts, he kind of gets displaced. He ends up in a different country. He accidentally kills his father and sleeps with his mother. And so he's the quintessential outlaw. He's a sort of ghost-like creature. He's driven mad. He takes out his own eyes, so there's the blindness aspect. And ultimately, he blames the city of Thebes for the evil that he does, the crimes that he commits. And so when you look at Oedipus, there's this sense that law produces crime. So we'll make an arrow here rather than an equal sign. But the laws that are in place force the stranger to do certain things. And this is typical of postmodernism, right? It's not surprising to see Derrida saying these things, and I tend to disagree here. But it's this notion that it's law that in a sense creates transgression, that creates crime. And that makes us think then too about this conditional hospitality, which for Derrida is so limited. And while it creates hospitality, it almost simultaneously creates this unease and this tension, and it may even create xenophobia or the fear of the stranger. So we've looked at a few of these kind of literary examples here. There's one more I should mention, and Derrida, by the way, he calls these epigraphs. So he sees these as sort of examples that we need to get out of the way before we can talk about the more abstract aspects of hospitality. And the last one I'll mention here is the example of Socrates. So Socrates is, of course, one of the main characters in Plato's works. And first of all, he likes to ask a lot of questions. So that brings us back to this issue of, well, what's the value of the question? Socrates sees himself as a midwife delivering a baby, and the baby here is the truth that is inside the person who's being talked to. And by asking lots of questions, you can bring the truth out. So you know something, or you find out you knew something that you weren't really aware of. Socrates also sees himself as a bit like a foreigner. So he's not saying I am a foreigner, but he's saying I feel like a foreigner. And there are different reasons for that. So the main scene that Plato examines here is where Socrates is put on trial. And Socrates is being accused of perverting the youth of Athens. And so people want to kill him. He does end up dying, of course, in the end. But as he's being accused here, one of the questions that comes up is, can he leave after his trial? So there may be a chance for him simply to escape and to say, okay, see you guys later, I'm out of here. But Socrates raises this issue of, well, if I'm in a country, do I have to abide by the law, right? And there's that question of law again that we saw before. Should I abide by the law? Is this like a pact that cannot be broken? And so the issue of hospitality continually ends up being tethered to or tied to the issue of law. Now, when it comes to law then, for Socrates and for Plato, we can see this in relation to two things. So one of these is language, and the other is the issue of rights. So language and rights. And when it comes to language, the question is, well, how much does a foreigner really understand? Is it fair to take somebody to a court of justice if they are a foreigner? Because they're going to have such a hard time even understanding what the process is, they are immediately at a disadvantage. So that's one of the issues that comes up here. And Socrates also talks about his own use of language at his trial, how he has to be careful because he wants to speak in a colloquial language, but he also needs to use philosophical language because that's who he is. So how is he going to get this across, and how is he going to be understood? And that's in part why he feels like a foreigner. We also have the issue of rights, as I mentioned, because if you are a foreigner, you have rights. And so Socrates is basically saying, even a foreigner has rights in this court. And so you need to treat me with respect, right? You can't just be abusive towards me. And the foreigner is identified by a particular dialect, by a language, and then that gives the foreigner certain rights. Okay, we've really sketched out then this level of unease that Derrida talks about in relation to absolute and conditional hospitality. I want to do a few final things here. So I want to kind of sketch out or add a little bit more detail to this picture here of the host and the stranger in relation to the state. And we're going to also talk briefly about Immanuel Kant, who comes up towards more towards the end of this seminar as well. So when we think of hospitality, one of the difficulties that we face in the postmodern era, we might say, or in the technological era, is that the state is constantly in our homes, is trying to police our homes. And one of the ways in which the state does this is by means of technology. So technology, the state can tap our phones, can investigate our emails. And of course, when Derrida is writing this at the end of the 1990s, a lot of this is very new. So he's kind of dealing with cutting edge stuff. But the state is controlling what we might call the public sphere. The public sphere, there we go. And they do this, for example, by banning pornography. They might not ban the more literary versions of pornography, like the Marquis de Sade. They might ban other versions. But Derrida does ask this question, well, is this an infringement somehow on private rights and private space? The state then limits my hospitality, because as soon as you invade my home, well, what is the home that I have to give to others? And on the one hand, the public sphere is a great place for democracy and for openness. But on the other hand, there's all of this policing that's going on. And Derrida compares this to daylight, how the state is not necessarily doing things in secret, but by being very active and very forceful, they actually police in daylight. They control the daylight to some extent. And the extra essay by Dufour-Montel talks about this a little bit as well, the day versus the night. So the public sphere then is a place that is contested. It's also a place of ethics, or what Derrida refers to as ethos, ethos, which we should think of here as a place of morality, a place where we have the laws of the land, the ways in which people have accustomed to do things, public morality. Hegel refers to this as Sittlichkeit. It's a kind of objective morality of the community. And somehow, when I practice absolute hospitality, I need to do this in this larger space of ethos, of public morality. So this becomes difficult, right? And we can also add the aspect of social class here as well. How do I practice hospitality in relation to different class levels and so on? Derrida doesn't really investigate this too much. He doesn't really pursue the Marxist angle very much, but it is nevertheless there in the background. Okay then, so we have all of this stuff happening outside of my home, infringing on my home, but at the same time we can say, well, there's also an enlarging of the private space. And what happens here is that I can, pick up the phone and I can phone my friend in a different country and say, hey, come on over. I'm going to invite you and I'm going to show some hospitality to you. Well, in this case, I am kind of decreasing the powers of the state because I'm crossing the border here. There's no longer the sense of the national border preventing me from showing hospitality. And by the way, if I send a message to the outside world, then I need to encode it. And this relates to stuff Derrida writes about a lot elsewhere, which is the idea of iterability. So iterability, oops, there you go. Hopefully you can read that. Iterability is the idea that signs, like words, need to be able to be repeated in different contexts and still make sense. If I send a message in a bottle, when somebody opens that and reads it, I'm not there to explain it, right? And Derrida elsewhere really contested this idea that the intention of the speaker is a kind of anchor for the meaning of the text. Instead, the text, the words, have to be encoded and have to be separated and have to start making sense by themselves. It's a bit of a side issue, but you can see how Derrida tries to bring all these ideas together here. What we see then is that hospitality, this private space, is contested, and it is also contesting the outside world. Now, what we see then is that this relationship between the host and the guest in this very difficult and fraught situation becomes problematic and becomes difficult to negotiate. So a few final things, and then I'll turn to Kant just to wrap things up. The Greek term for hospitality is xenia. So we talked about the xenos, or the stranger, but we can also talk about xenia, or hospitality. And here Derrida uses the ideas of Émile Benveniste, although he's criticizing them as well as being too limited. But for Benveniste, xenia is very much about a kind of pact that we have between the host and the stranger. And a pact, an agreement, includes rights and obligations. You come to a country, you have obligations, but you also have rights, and as a host, I need to treat you in a certain way. But this type of hospitality, as we can see, is very much focused on law, on conditional hospitality. Now, the other aspect of this is that when we welcome the stranger, we don't just welcome an individual, but we also welcome a family. And when we talk to the person and we ask their name, what we are saying in a sense is, what is your lineage? What's your genealogy? What is your background? And Derrida writes, a proper name is never purely individual, right? So we are welcoming you in, but if you leave your country, you're also saying farewell to all of your roots, to your family, even to the burial grounds of your family. And how are you going to negotiate that, right? There's this immense sense of loss as you come into our country, and that's partially also why we have this incredible obligation towards you. Okay then, so we have sketched out the whole picture. We've talked about a lot of different things. The last thing, as I promised, is that we need to talk briefly about Immanuel Kant. So what does he have to do with all of this? Well, a few things. So Kant talked about hospitality, and he kind of defended conditional hospitality. That's what we've seen so far. In the second seminar, Derrida will go into this in more depth as well. And Kant basically said, okay, you're a stranger, you come to this country, we cannot just show you hostility, we have to treat you with respect, but you also, you may need to get a visa kind of thing. You may need to do things properly and abide by the law. So Kant is very much saying this, and he's saying this in order to really create the sense of the nation state as a place where there are rules, and nation states can live in peace with each other, and there are proper ways of doing things. He's sort of imagining a future world order, you might say. Okay, so that's one aspect of Kant's ideas. But Kant also thinks a lot about the question of ethics, right? And one of the ideas he's well known for is this sense of the categorical imperative. If you're going to do something, in terms of duty or ethics, you should be able to universalize this. You should be able to do it in every situation. And the classic example of where push comes to shove and where we can see the difficulties with this is with the issue of lying. So imagine that a stranger comes to your house and wants to hide because the stranger is being persecuted by others. Somebody wants to kill this stranger. And so you hide this person. You show hospitality. But then somebody else comes, a murderer or an assassin. And this person says, hey, where is this person? Are you hiding this person? And Kant says, okay, well, you have an ethical duty here to tell the truth. Because if truth-telling is something important to you, you should do it in every single situation. So that sounds okay until you realize that now you have to give up the person who's staying with you, and as a result, this person may be killed. Difficult question. Later in time, this question became known as lying to the Nazis. If the Nazis knock on your door, would you give up the Jew who's hiding with you? We should, of course, remember here that this is not simply a question of either I tell the truth or I lie. There is a third option as well, which is to be silent or to refuse to answer. And, of course, there's a fourth option, which is to shoot back. There are different ways to respond to this. Now, for Kant, one of the reasons why we want to tell the truth is because truth-telling is really essential for having a community that works. How do we live with other people if we can't have a strong social bond that's dependent on law and right and truth-telling and things like that? Derrida, on the other hand, says in this work, well, you know what? The only way to contest this is to actually stand up for absolute hospitality. Hospitality and truth-telling are coming into conflict here, and I need to lie. And by telling a lie, it's almost like I create a little space, right? I tell this lie, and I create a safe space by doing so, and this protects the other person. But it also prevents truth-telling from taking over everything. So truth-telling here is almost like the police, which investigates everything, and everything becomes clear and enters the daylight. Sometimes it's better if I hide some stuff, right? And this is where Derrida uses the word perjury. I need to lie. I need to create space by lying. And so I actually protect the home by lying here. It's a very interesting argument, I think. It raises all sorts of ethical questions. I actually agree with Derrida in the sense that sometimes you may need to lie, but I don't love his suggestion that somehow lying creates this space, or that lying is necessary to create hospitality. The link between lying and hospitality, I think, is one that I find, maybe somewhat problematic, but lots to think about anyways. So what we see then is that ultimately Derrida takes the idea of absolute justice and connects it with the categorical imperative, and he says that's the part from Kant that you need to keep and apply it to the notion of absolute hospitality. But he says you have to do it with one caution, because absolute hospitality can never be totally about duty, right? It should be so natural, and it should be something you do before questioning it, before saying, is this necessary or not? And so it is like a categorical imperative, but not quite. It's something that we do because we have this radical obligation to the other, to the stranger.